tonight's program, we are talking with the author David Meyers and his daughter Amish Meyers Walker. Also, they co-authored the book A Murder in Amish Ohio, The Martyrdom of Paul Koblenz. And my name is Robert Dooner. I am a reference librarian at the Utica Public Library. I read their book this past week, and I found it very informative, interesting, and I would recommend our library users to also check out his book at our library or within our system, or purchase it. And having said that, please join me in welcoming David Meyers tonight.
Thank you, Robert. As Robert said, my name is David Meyers. I am the author, along with my daughter, Amish Meyers Walker, of A Murder in Amish Ohio, The Martyrdom of Paul Koblenz. I am coming to you tonight from my daughter's basement because she is more technically adroit than I am when it comes to Zoom. In fact, she uses it every day. Unfortunately, she cannot participate because of a scheduling conflict. Our first book was published in 2009. And we have turned out at least one new title every year since. At any given time, we are working on 3 or 4 books, other books on all matter of subjects. Our next book is under contract, and we have 3 others we could publish right now if we had the time to round up publishers for them. But then I wouldn't be speaking with you, which is another aspect of a writer's job. We have to go out and market our books in order to keep our publishers, we have 5 of them, happy. I would prefer to be addressing you in person tonight. I feel my presentation benefits from having a live audience I can play off of. For example, I like to walk around the room and direct comments to specific individuals, especially those who are making faces or otherwise look like they're upset about something. But obviously that's not going to be happening. Still, I invite questions and other feedback, preferably at the end of my presentation. All right, so let's get started. We are often asked where we get our ideas from. Usually that's not a very interesting story. This time, however, I think it actually is. But first, some background about me. I can't remember when I haven't been a writer. As far back as elementary school, I have had a need to write longer and more complicated stories than my classmates. Even today, I write 100,000 words when the publisher asks for no more than 50,000. So I wind up doing a lot of editing. Sometimes what starts out as one book will end up as 2. We had one book that grew out of a chapter we had to delete, and this particular book started out as a few photographs in an earlier book. For most of my life, I made little effort to get published. It wasn't until I became friends with Randy McNutt, another writer, that I really was encouraged to seek a publisher. And when I did, I was hooked. I like seeing my stuff in print. I think every writer gets a kick out of seeing his or her book on display in a bookstore. Coincidentally, my daughter had just graduated from college, so I asked her if she wanted to collaborate on a book, and she agreed. I should mention that she had already started writing newspaper and magazine articles because others had asked her to do so. Unlike me, however, she does not feel the need to write. Many writers say writing is hard, but for me, not writing is harder. At the time, Elise and I had just toured a tiny museum in Haydenville, one of my favorite places in Ohio. Haydenville is a former company town in Hocking County that was built around a brick and tile plant, but it was also associated with coal mining and therefore considered one of Hocking Valley's little cities of black diamonds. Elise and I immediately seized upon the idea of writing a book about them. Having become friends with Nyla Volmer, the museum's curator, we were invited to join her at the annual Black Diamond Days celebration to do research for our proposed book. We made contacts, conducted interviews, copied photographs, and began a first draft. I felt very confident that we had a great story to tell, exactly the kind of story I would want to read. So I submitted a book proposal to my publisher. Writing proposals isn't something I enjoy, and I don't feel I'm very good at it. On rare occasions, I've been able to talk my way out of it, but not this time. Fortunately, the publisher loved it. We immediately began negotiating a contract. A few weeks later, however, everything ground to a halt. It turned out someone else had submitted a similar proposal several years earlier. While ours had been accepted, theirs hadn't, and they weren't very happy about it. Frankly, I think someone, likely an editor, had dropped the ball someplace. Since the other authors had more of a track record than we did, we agreed to bow out just to keep peace in the publishing family. However, when their book came out the following year, I was happy to see they hadn't told the same story we intended to tell. They had omitted some things I felt needed to be included. A lot, actually. The most important parts, in my opinion. I always figured we could return to the subject somewhere down the road, and 8 years later we did. To be honest, I think our book benefited from the delay. People tell us our book is better, and who am I to disagree with someone who agrees with me? At the time, we needed a new subject for a book. Since I'd worked in adult and juvenile corrections for 30 years, my daughter and I decided to do a book on prisons. She loves to tell people how I used to take her along on Take Your Daughter to Work Day. I already had a lot of information on prisons and prison history, and I knew people I could get in touch with if I needed something else. It was almost like I had been planning to write this book since the first day I walked into the Ohio Reformatory in Mansfield. And in all likelihood, I was. So instead of doing a book on coal mining, we did one on the development of Ohio's prison system, focusing on the Ohio Penitentiary, the Ohio State Reformatory, and the Boys Industrial School, all of which I knew firsthand. Being an Arcadia book, it is crammed with photos, more than 200. We also squeezed in the absolute maximum number of words. I'm always concerned about giving the reader his or her money's worth, more likely a her. Most of our readers are women, and since 2/3 of adults never read anything for pleasure, I am forever grateful to those who do. In writing about the Ohio Penitentiary, we included some of the more famous crimes and criminals. One of these was the murder of an Amish farmer, Paul Koblenz, in 1957. We didn't go into great detail, but we did include several photos with our brief summary of the crime. As far as I was concerned, that was all we would ever write about it. However, when we attended the Buckeye Book Fair in Worcester that November, we were surprised to see how many Amish people came to our table. They specifically wanted to see what had been written about the Koblenz murder. Word had apparently spread through the Amish grapevine. Now, both my daughter and I were delighted to think that our book was being read in Amish households because we had long been fascinated by their culture. We had made many day trips to Ohio's Amish country and have acquired many books on Amish culture. After that, we went on to write a number of other books, including the one on coal mining in the Hocking Valley. But each time we returned to the book fair in Worcester, we noticed that the Amish were interested in the Paul Koblenz murder. So this idea began to form in my head that we would write a history of crimes against the Amish, or something of that nature. But I knew we would have to restrict it to Ohio because our publisher wouldn't be interested in a book that covered several states. That's not their business model. They are strictly a regional publisher. As we have learned, every publisher specializes in certain types of books, and you're required to adhere to their format. If you have a book you want published, you just can't go to any publisher. You have to find the one who is right for you and for your book. And that can take time, longer than it takes to write a book. As we began delving into our subject, we came to realize that the Koblenz murder was a significant one of the most significant ones of the 20th century. Yet very little had been written about it apart from the original newspaper articles. and much of what had been written was frankly wrong. So when you write a history book, question everything. I could point out a few bestsellers that have major errors in them because the authors relied too heavily on what others had written before them. We have found, for example, many examples of people who were reported to have died, but actually didn't, not until a lot later anyway. Personally, I know of writers who are content to read several books or articles and then summarize them. I am not one of those. As a rule, I do not write a book about a certain topic unless I can bring something new to it. That's a challenge when you're writing about an incident that occurred over 60 years ago, but that's what makes the book fun for me as the writer. As my daughter and I always say, we write the books we want to read and hope someone else will want to read them too. As it turned out, Paul Koblenz's murder had resonated not only throughout Ohio, but across the nation. It was a huge story. Although it wasn't on the same scale as the 2006 shooting of 8 Amish girls at West Nickel Mine School in Pennsylvania, it was more significant legally, politically, and sociologically, and it would become the touchstone for all subsequent arguments against capital punishment. To put it into perspective, we include a chapter which summarizes crimes committed against the Amish since they first arrived in the United States, right up until the Koblenz murder. We were especially interested in what types of crimes the Ohio Amish endured. They are subjected to some degree of harassment simply because of the way they dress and live. For example, teenage boys sometimes throw stones at their buggies. These types of nuisance crimes even have their own name, claping, and they are frequently the victims of car buggy collisions. But the murder of an Amish man or Amish woman is extraordinarily rare, and the murder of Paul Koblenz was the first one in modern times. In our society, victims of most crimes automatically lose their right to privacy. Why? Because the investigations of the crimes and the subsequent trials become part of the public record. As a result, the murder of Paul Koblenz opened a window into Amish culture unlike anything that had preceded it. Amish tourism, by which I mean people driving to Amish country to have a look around, barely existed at the time, especially in Ohio. But when Paul Koblenz was gunned down in cold blood, the world came rushing into Holmes County. And what they found were these odd-dressed German-speaking people who seemed to live in a time warp where nothing had changed for a century or two. What made this murder different from the other random murders was the victim. There was more interest in who he was than in who had done it. And for those people who preached nonviolence and forgiveness, it became a teaching moment, one that will continue for decades to follow. Among the questions that the Koblenz murder raised in the public mind were, who were the Amish? Where did they come from? Why did they speak German? What did they have against progress? How could they be so forgiving of Paul's killers? How could they welcome the killer's family into their own? Some people suggested that the Amish must be a cold and unemotional people who do not experience grief the way everyone else does. So not only did reporters scramble to cover the story of the murder, they also tried to explain who and what the Amish were. That there was such a peculiar group of people living in the United States came as a surprise to many people. Unless you lived in parts of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and a few other places, you likely never even encountered them, let alone had a conversation. Yet the plain people, as they call themselves, were living in plain sight, although somewhat off the beaten track. The fact that these same questions were being asked 50 years later, following the shootings at West Nickel Mines, suggests that we still have much to learn about our Amish neighbors. Fortunately, a lot more research has been done over the intervening years. Unfortunately, there have also been several so-called reality shows, Amish Mafia and Breaking Amish, for example, which mixed truth and fiction for dramatic purposes. A lot of the confusion stems from the fact that there are four main groups of Amish and a number of subgroups, each with their own rules. And Ohio, unlike Pennsylvania, contained a representation of all of them. Since Paul Koblenz and his family were old order Amish, they're the ones everyone thinks of when someone refers to the Amish, we have focused on that particular order, which is representative of most, but not all Amish. And we have also tried to recreate their life as it was at the time the murder took place. Believe it or not, some things have changed during the intervening years. We began our research by combing through newspaper files to begin piecing the story together. Our initial goal was to create a general outline of what happened as it was unfolding. Even as we did so, we could see that some of the supposed facts conflicted with other facts. Sometimes these would be straightened out afterward, but some never would be. Newspaper accounts are called the first draft of history, but it's a rare first draft that doesn't require rewriting and correction. Mistakes happen. In our books, we try not to repeat them or introduce new ones if we possibly can. In the end, we decided to tell the story 3 times. The first account would be the story as it was breaking in the media. There were numerous articles and updates published throughout the country following the discovery of the crime, the pursuit of the suspects, and the preparations for the trials. The second time would be an account of what was testified to during the trial of the first defendant. Since he was the trigger man, the focus was on whether he would receive the death penalty. He was tried by a jury of his peers. However, it did not include any Amish because they did not believe they should sit in judgment of others. They leave that to God. And the third time would be an account of what was testified to during the trial of the second defendant. His sentence would likely be equal to or less than his co-defendant, and the case was heard by a 3-judge panel instead of a jury. While there is overlap among the 3 accounts, there are also places where they diverge and there is a different emphasis. The story begins on the evening of July 18, 1957, just across the field from the Salt Creek Township Meeting House in Holmes County, Ohio. After getting their stolen vehicle stuck in a ditch, 2 young men, Mike DeMullen, age 20, and Gene Peters, 19, spotted a light burning at the house of Paul Koblenz. So they began walking toward it through the darkness. They had just come from a bar in Holmesville, where they consumed an unknown quantity of beer. Whether they were intoxicated or not was a question that was never answered. It might have helped their defense. The 2 men had been groundhog hunting earlier that day. Gene carried Mike's gun, while Mike had a hunting knife in his hand. Inside the house, Paul Koblenz was eating a snack of breakfast cereal. His wife, Dora, was making preparations to feed the threshing crew that would be arriving early the next day to gather in their grain harvest. Both were 25 years old and had been married a couple of years. Their infant daughter, Esther, was asleep in a nearby room. The Koblenzes were living in the basement of their unfinished house, a short distance from Paul's parents' home. Normally, they would have occupied the big house, but Paul's sisters were still living with their parents. Paul was being groomed to take over the farm when his father retired. Suddenly, the dog began to bark, and Paul stepped outside through the kitchen door to investigate. Carrying her baby, Dora went to the kitchen door to check on Paul. She was immediately met by Mike DeMullen, who was carrying a lever-action rifle. He asked if they had horses. She said they did, but they had been turned loose in the meadow. He then forced her back inside the kitchen. Mike was followed by Gene, who had a knife trained on Paul. He ordered the Amish man to lie down on the kitchen floor, while Dora was directed to sit in a chair. Demanding Paul's wallet, Gene robbed him of $9, but then gave him back the $5 bill when Paul said that was all the money he had. While this was going on, Mike was said to be menacing Dora and the baby with a knife, going so far as to scratch them with it. Dora indicated that he even threatened to rape her. Mike would later deny this, claiming that he was in the pantry eating peaches at the time. All at once, Paul jumped up and ran toward the back door. Gene responded by swinging the rifle up to his shoulder and shooting him in the back. Paul fell forward through this door and onto the concrete sidewalk outside. Gene then walked up and shot him in the back of the skull, execution style, just to make certain he was dead. Awakened by the gunshots, Mose and Susie, Paul's parents, came running from their house. Mose was carrying a lantern. At the same time, Mike had run outside, grabbed the rifle away from Gene, and fired a warning shot in the air. The two men then fled into the darkness. When he reached Paul's home, Mose found his son dying on the pavement. Leaving Susie to tend him, Mose ran a third of a mile to the nearest farm for help. He told the neighbor what had happened, and the neighbor then took off another third of a mile for the next closest farm that had a telephone. It was the rare Amish farm that had a telephone anywhere nearby, although a few would have one in the barn for business purposes. At about 11:30, Edith Weiss, wife of County Sheriff Harry Weiss, and the mother of 6, took the call about the shooting at Paul Koblenz's farm. Sheriff Weiss was out on a police run at the time, but immediately abandoned it and headed for the Koblenz place. Along the way, he picked up the Millersburg police chief to assist him. Murders didn't happen very often in Holmes County, so he would need all the help he could get. Harry Weiss, age 59, had been a lawman on 22 years, a band leader, pugilist, marksman, and collector of historic relics. He had the reputation of being a big-time sheriff in a small town. His wife, Edith, looked after the jail when he wasn't around, and his son, Darrell, was his deputy. It was very much a family business. The kids had grown up there. The only interruption in Harry's career as a county sheriff had been a decade earlier when he resigned after embezzling money for the pay of his female deputy. No explanation was ever given, and when he ran for office again, he was reelected. Cutting across country, Mike and Gene reached Fredericksburg about 5 miles away where they stole a 1953 Pontiac. Gene wanted to go home to Iowa, while Mike figured he would continue on up to Canada. He thought he could hide out there. That was their plan anyway, to the extent that they had one. They were still packing the rifle Gene had used to kill the Amish farmer, so the police considered them armed and dangerous. In particular, were terrified that they might strike again. The next day, Sheriff Weiss was able to lift some fingerprints from Dora's glasses. Mike had taken them away from her, and also from the steering wheel of the stolen truck they had abandoned in the ditch. As a result, the suspects were tentatively identified as Mike DeMullen and Chester Carter. Chester, said to be a known associate of Mike's, was picked up the following day in Wooster, Ohio, one county over from where the murder took place. He was innocent. Mike would later say that he had no idea who Chester Carter was or why the police thought they were friends. Meanwhile, the suspect's trail had grown cold. Although the police received several tips suggesting Gene and Mike had driven east, they were actually headed west. Reporters from all levels of the food chain converged on Holmes County, looking for a story. In the absence of any progress in the investigation, they focused their attention on the Amish people. And the more they learned about them, the more puzzled they became. Although the death penalty was losing favor in the United States, most people still believe that killers should be punished. But the Amish seemed more interested in healing and forgiveness. Sure, they wanted the men who had slain Paul Koblenz apprehended, but not out of vindictiveness. They harbored no animosity toward the men, but they were concerned about their souls as well as their own. They had to accept that Paul's death was God's will and move on with their lives. That was the Amish way. The fact that Paul had not put up a fight was seen as a thing, a testament to his faith. He was a martyr. Then on Saturday, 2 days after the murder took place, a constable, Emery Baldwin of Lacan, Illinois, saw something suspicious at a fishing cottage along the Illinois River. When he stopped to investigate, someone shot him with a rifle, twice. Fortunately, the wounds weren't fatal. It didn't take long to trace the stolen car hidden nearby to the two fugitives from Ohio. Now the chase began in earnest. Following the unprovoked attack upon the Illinois lawman, a large-scale manhunt was launched. The two men had apparently fled down the river in a stolen boat. Everyone was put on notice to be on the lookout for the fugitives. Given that they had killed one man and shot a police officer, the expectation was that they would not be taken alive. Certainly, the Illinois police weren't going to take any chances. Finally, Mike and Jean were discovered at Galva, Illinois. After abandoning their boat, they had stolen yet another truck, but when it ran out of gas, they hitched a ride with a school teacher who dropped them off just outside of town. Soon they were spotted by a milk hauler who recognized them and called the police. Arrested by the county sheriff, they offered no resistance and readily admitted their guilt. They were tired of running. Because they were wanted for murder in Ohio, Sheriff Weiss, his son Darrell, and another deputy quickly set out for Lacan, Illinois, to take them into custody. By then, Jean and Mike had made written confessions to the murder of Paul Koblenz. Mike had been eager to put the blame on Jean, and Jean readily accepted it. Neither had any explanation for their actions, and they both seemed to be resigned to the fact that they would probably get the death penalty if convicted. Once returned to Ohio and lodged in the Holmes County Jail, the partners in crime again made written confessions to the murder. However, the admissibility of these two sets of confessions, made without benefit of legal counsel and possibly under duress, would be challenged. When my daughter and I set out to write a book about the murder of Paul Koblenz, we didn't know what information we would have access to on the newspaper accounts. We knew we could tell the story, but that wasn't enough. But then when we began, we hoping that we would eventually find other sources. Our first step was to create a chronology, a step-by-step, day-by-day, and sometimes hour-by-hour account of what happened. This was not as easy as you might think because the newspaper articles were inconsistent. In discussing the problem with a writer friend of ours who had covered trials himself, he said it was not unusual for the reporters to stop in for a few minutes in the morning, leave, and then stop in for a few minutes later in the end of the day, rather than sitting through the whole trial. So instead of reporting what they had directly heard in court, they were sometimes relying upon others to fill them in on what they had missed. Often they were out covering other stories in between. So the key was locating the trial transcripts. Jean was tried first, followed by Mike. However, the Holmes County Clerk of Court's office could only locate the transcript for Jean's trial. This could either be because Mike's had been misplaced or possibly never returned by one of the attorneys. I also suspect more care was taken with Jean's transcript because his case was presented to the Ohio Supreme Court. It would have been interesting to compare them because the format of the two trials were different. While Jean was tried by a jury, Mike was tried by a panel of 3 judges. These represent different strategies by the defense attorneys. In Jean's trial, they were clearly hoping that they were making an emotional appeal for at least one of the members of the jury to reject the death penalty. While in Mike's, they were counting on the judges to fairly weigh the law. The folder for Jean's trial included the exhibits that had been submitted, except for the rifle, and Jean's signed confession. As it turned out, neither Jean nor Mike testified in their own trials, in their own defense. So their confessions were the closest thing we have to what their personal testimony might have been. When we'd almost given up hope of finding a copy of Mike's confession, we discovered the Holmes County Historical Society had bound copies of the Holmes County Farmers Hub, an old newspaper that was published in Millersburg. And the Hub had printed Mike's entire confession. While it would have been better to have the actual transcript so that we would have seen a photocopy of the confession, we assumed that the Hub had reproduced it fairly accurately. As far as the testimony given during Mike's trial, the witnesses were much the same as the ones who had testified in Jean's. However, there was apparently greater attention given to Mike's interaction with Dora. She was the key witness in both trials and had borne up well. Amish women are not accustomed to being the focus of attention, let alone discussing personal matters in a public forum. But that was what she was asked to do. Unfortunately, we only had the summaries of her testimony as published in the newspapers, and not all reporters apparently heard the same thing. The bottom line, though, was that Mike was never officially charged with molesting Dora in any fashion. She made it clear that she had not been raped, despite some newspaper reports to the contrary. Jean, pictured on the left, went on trial in December 1957. He was charged with first-degree murder. Admitted trigger man, he was sentenced to death. Although the defense team tried to persuade the jury that the Amish would want them to spare his life, they didn't agree. Neither did they consider the fact that it was clearly a crime of impulse and in no way premeditated. While Mike, pictured on the right, went on trial in January 1958, his defense team hoped that the three-judge panel would convict him of something less than first-degree murder. After all, he hadn't personally killed anyone. Although he was convicted of murder as well, he was sentenced to life in prison. It was considered a win by the defense. At least he wasn't going to die. Both men were then transported to the Ohio Penitentiary, Jean to death row and Mike to the regular population. And that was the real story, was where the real story began, because the Amish and the Mennonite communities were determined not to allow Jean to be executed in her name, and they would take their campaign all the way to the governor's office. We were hoping to glean information from Jean and Mike's stays in various jails and prisons. However, the laws concerning the archiving of records are such that few survive from that far back, other than a card that summarizes admission data, changes of status, and releases. The fact is that most jurisdictions don't have the warehousing space that would be required to keep these records. Historic prison records are sent to the Ohio History Connection in Columbus, but they have not all been cataloged. Even federal prison records are pretty spotty. However, having worked in the adult prison system in Ohio, I was able to reconstruct what life would typically have been like for the two men while they were in prison, first at the Ohio Penitentiary and then Marion Correctional Institution. I relied upon my own observations, supplemented by newspaper and magazine articles. We were also interested in providing the Amish perspective on the crime. As it turns out, the Amish maintain fairly detailed genealogies or family trees. These have been useful in tracking the incidence of various genetic illnesses through families. Since they share a limited number of surnames, this is the only way of keeping track of who's who. This has led some of them to publish histories of their various communities, such as this one on Mount Hope. The Copeland's family lived just outside of Mount Hope, and one Amish farmer contributed an article about Paul's murder, which provides an Amish perspective on the crime. Other Amish or former Amish have also reflected on the Copeland's murder over the years. It has also been mentioned in Amish and Mennonite newspapers. However, the most unusual book we discovered was this one, Tragedies Along County Road 235, and there have been a lot of them. The author was the second cousin of Paul's widow and knew the family well. Not only that, the books provide additional information about the family and Amish life which helps to round out the picture. There is even a chapter written by Paul's widow, Dora, concerning another tragedy which occurred in her own family. This gave us insight into her upbringing and allowed us to make connections to other relatives and friends. We were especially interested in learning what we could about Dora's life after the death of her husband. Actually, we did learn a fair amount, but chose not to publish it out of respect for her privacy. Imagine our surprise when we learned that Amish women grieve just like everyone else. That's a joke. However, their channels for expressing their grief may be a little more limited. They are private people. They do not generally engage in public displays of emotion. However, this has led to the rise of a literary genre, grief books. While the Amish do not generally write books, some Amish women do keep diaries and journals. Emma King, for one, published a book about the murder of her aunt. It was a collection of ruminations arising out of her personal feelings regarding the incident. During that time, she had the opportunity to meet with Paul Koblenz's widow, Dora, who had come to the area to offer comfort by sharing her own experience. However, Emma turned it down because she did not want to hear about another tragedy. As she noted, writing down her feelings had done the work of a psychiatrist for her. Apparently, others found her little book helpful too. Although the story is not for the faint-hearted, Aunt Naomi's murder was a gruesome affair. As it turns out, forgiveness does not bring an end to suffering by the survivors. When Esther Smucker shared with a few of her female friends some of the private thoughts she had set down in her journal following the death of her 5-year-old son, they urged her to publish them. They felt others would be helped knowing they weren't alone in their feelings of sorrow, depression, guilt, and religious doubt. So Esther did, and the book sold 1,000 copies in just 3 weeks. 25 years later, Good Night, My Son is still in print. Like Emma King, Esther Smucker had tapped into a market that wasn't being served, Amish women who were struggling with grief. And not just Amish women. There were people of all persuasions who derived benefit from reading about the experiences of others in comparable situations. But the death of her 5-year-old was not the only tragedy in Esther Smucker's life. She had lost another son to crib death. And Emma King's murdered Aunt Naomi was Esther Smucker's aunt as well. The Amish are such a closely knit group that a tragedy in one family almost invariably affects them all. As a result, they've begun holding an annual sudden death reunion in which those who have lost loved ones through accidents or illnesses get together to comfort one another. However, one of the most important books in understanding the Amish is Martyr's Mirror. First published in 1660, it recounts the deaths of some 4,000 people who were martyrs to their faith. One of the best known was Dirk Willems, who escaped from prison and fled across a frozen lake. But when he saw that his pursuer had fallen through the ice, he went back to save him, was recaptured, and then burned at the stake. The message to the Amish was clear: non-resistance, do not fight back. Paul Koblenz was viewed as a martyr to the faith for that reason. When he jumped up to flee from the house, it was undoubtedly to get help. The thought of physically confronting Mike and Jean would never have occurred to him. The Amish are taught never to raise a hand in anger. They must not think evil of those who seek to harm them. They view any kind of force, even the force of law, to be contrary to the Christian spirit. Death, even murder, is not a punishment, but God's will. Early on, we contacted a friend of ours who was a private investigator to see if we could determine whether Gene Peters and Mike DeMullen had stayed out of trouble once they were released from prison. Checking the databases available to him, he found that they apparently had. I was also able to obtain a recent address from Mike, so I wrote a letter telling him what I was doing and inviting him to contact me if he wanted to tell his side of the story. To my surprise, Mike did. What followed was a series of phone calls. I questioned him about the crime, as well as his life before and after. I asked him if I could record our conversations, and he readily agreed. I felt this was important because neither Mike nor Gene were placed on the witness stand during their trials, so there were a lot of questions that hadn't been answered. During my 30 years working in both adult and juvenile corrections, I had interviewed many murderers. Mike was the first one who said he felt he deserved to die for his involvement in Paul's death simply because he was there when it happened. I got the sense that he was kind of drifting rudderless through life, and it took the structure of prison to turn him around. When he finally gained his release, he had learned a marketable skill. He was a stationary engineer and had met a woman who possibly saw more in him than he saw in himself. Then there was True Detective. The author of the article also was a pulp fiction writer, so he used his imagination to fill in the missing pieces, even adding his own dialogue. Mike's father had bought a copy for him when it came out. He said he didn't even recognize himself in it. Obviously, we didn't use much of True Detective in our book. Sheriff Harry Weiss was a memorable character in his own right. Here he is leading a family band. One of the most startling things we just uncovered in piecing this story together is that both Gene and Mike were later related to the sheriff through marriage. According to several sources, they even socialized to some extent at various family gatherings. Mike said the Weisses never brought up their crimes nor made them feel uncomfortable. After Harry retired, his son Daryl became the Holmes County Sheriff. Like the rest of his family, he had grown up in the sheriffing business. In the end, Gene Peters was spared from death in the electric chair, largely through the efforts of the Amish and Mennonite communities. Although they were no doubt gratified that he had become a Christian while in prison, they likely would have done the same for anyone in a similar situation. They were simply living their faith. Mike DeMullen served 14 years and 7 months in prison, while Gene was released after 15 years and 3 months. Following his release, Mike married Evelyn Robbie Moyer, a childhood friend who was also the sister of Daryl Weiss's wife, Theda. She had begun corresponding with Mike while he was in prison. An extraordinary woman in many respects, Robbie passed away in 1990. Gene married Grace Moyer, sister of Robbie and Theda. They had been introduced by Mike while Gene was still in prison. She died 3 years later. For many years, Mike and Gene continued to keep in touch, although they had drifted apart by the time Gene passed away in Monmouth, Illinois in 2015. Ironically, Mike worked for many years with a team of Amish carpenters. He never tried to conceal his crime from them, and they never held it against him. Among the Amish, those who ask to be forgiven are forgiven, regardless of their sins. As far as we were able to determine, both Gene and Mike turned their lives around. There is nothing to indicate that they ever got in any more trouble. Then and now, Mike believed he deserved to die for his part in the death of Paul Koblenz, and the fact that he didn't prompted him to become a better person. He also became a Christian and remains quite active in his church. He says he still prays for Paul's family. Both my daughter and I have been making trips to Ohio's Amish country since we were kids. In doing so, we have always endeavored to be as respectful and understanding of the Amish culture as possible. My personal library on the Amish probably numbers about a dozen or so volumes, and we have interacted with the Amish on many occasions. Therefore, our goal when we set out to write this book was to be as honest, forthright, and accurate as we could be in presenting the Amish to our readers. From communications with them, we knew that the Amish would prefer that we not write about Paul Koblenz's murder, but it is a rare book that nobody objects to. Since its release, however, we have received word that those Amish who have read it are pleased with the respect that we showed them. Similarly, Mike DeMullen feels he was treated fairly, although it pains him to remember the person he once was. In both instances, we have simply presented the facts. I will now entertain any questions you might have.
I thank you, David, for your presentation tonight and after, we talked before your presentation started, and what I learned from your book was, and uh, it was an education of Amish cultures and values. It was a story of a tragedy, and it was also, like you said, the part with the convicts. I mean, I think redemption would be too strong of a word for what they did, but they did lead their lives after prison in a way like about as well as could be, expected or possible. Um, you know, I think it was and we didn't talk about uh, some of what you wanted to achieve in writing the book, but what I learned, uh, what you were saying, when you're writing about something that is, has been covered before, and like that you and your daughter Elise did not want to rely too heavily on previous accounts, and you wanted to bring something new into this story or tragedy. And I think you definitely uh, achieved that. And I'm happy to have read your book and that we have it in our collection. And I hope it's on the shelf in every library in the Cleveland or county system too, in the area. If I think as far as a question, I'm thinking I I think that, well, one of the things that I also learned, I mean, the idea that Amish people can be a target, or their community, for uh, harassment, or the idea, and this was mentioned in your book, of that since they don't, uh, they believe in complete forgiveness, that unfortunately might make them more of an attractive target for a crime. And I mean, I came away from your book having a lot of just respect and admiration for the Amish community.
Well, there is a lot to admire about them. I mean,
Yeah.
uh, my daughter and I, neither one of us want to be Amish,
No, right.
but there's a lot you can take away from getting to know the Amish. So there's very few people you can say that they live their faith, but it's
Yes.
pretty obvious to the Amish, that they've set themselves up for people to judge them.
Yeah. I mean, to put another way, they walk the walk. They don't just talk the talk. And um, so, but I thank you again for this evening's presentation, David, and we'll be looking forward to your next book or writing project. And thank you again.
Thank you very much.